mentioned, Tom Norcliffe is the acting appraisal manager, and he's going to launch the Legacy Records program, I should say.
Thanks, Natalie. Really interesting to hear those questions from the floor there, because I think hopefully we've been able to anticipate those and more in the program that we've developed. So if I don't answer questions as I go through, please grab me at the end. I'm currently the acting manager of appraisal, but sort of feel a little bit fraudulent, both in that role and standing up here as the person launching the program. Denise Williams, who is currently seconded to our access section, really ran the program, and I happen to be her 2IC and thus get the glory at the end. John's done a fantastic job of giving an overview as to why managing legacy records is such an important thing to do, not just because it says so in the Act, but for all the good business benefits that he outlined. I thought it might be useful, though, before we really get stuck in, to define what exactly we mean by legacy. We've used it as a shorthand, really, to talk about these things that are 25 years old, but particularly in light of the program that I'm launching today, it's more than 25 years. So I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. The Act, as John mentioned, there's sections 21 and sections 43 that define what we mean in terms of a 25-year-old record, which is one that has been in existence, which I think is kind of problematic when it comes to actually managing these in a practical sense. Does that mean when it was open, when the first folio was added to it, when it was closed, da-da-da? So we took a bit more of a pragmatic approach, which was that it's records that are potentially covered by those two sections and more. Acknowledging also the fact that when it comes to managing records, particularly around disposal and transfer, it's often easier to look at agglomerations of records, so a series or a class, and some of these might have come a lot more recently into the future than at 25 years. So when I talk about legacy records, I'm not talking about 25 years on the dot, I'm talking about that sort of broader category, which I think is probably an easier handle to use. I'll just get rid of this to stop this. So, as I said, John's done a fantastic job at describing the background. But just to recap very briefly, the Act says that Section 21 particularly says that records at 25 years old have to have something done to them, and that's generally a transfer or ideally disposal of some description, destruction maybe under GDAs or a specific disposal authority. And as John talked about, Section 43 is around declaring access to those records, whether they're at Archives New Zealand or still held by the Public Office. And it's also simply good business practice and risk management. You don't want to be holding on to stuff that you don't want to be paying for, that may be exposing you to risk if there's stuff in there that is being retained inappropriately, for instance, or that might have material in it that would otherwise have been destroyed but is maybe sensitive and shouldn't be hanging around. Diane, in her report to Parliament last year, also talked about Archives New Zealand getting on board and helping out with this issue, so hence really the program got a kickstart from that. And again, as John's mentioned, taking a more strategic and proactive approach to the management of these records, I think, is a useful thing to do. And just some slides that John's already sort of touched on, but I've got 61% there of public offices, and this is hot off the press from this year's survey, hold records over 25 years. And you can see that's up from the last couple of years. There's a bit of a dip there in 2007, so we must have been doing a good job in appraisal to get rid of that little bit there. Massive spike in public offices with legacy electronic records, and you can see there it went from 11% in 2007 through to, I think, 58% this year. So clearly there was a vendor out there in 1988, do my maths, 1982 or 1983 who did a really good job selling into public offices, and that's just sort of kicked through now. I think Eamon sort of touched on this. I doubt very much that any of these are either accessible or, even if that figure's maybe exactly correct, when we initiated the program, our focus was primarily on paper, or at least analogue records of a stable kind of temperament. And so the focus has been all the way through on developing the program around managing that paper exposure. Running in parallel, or at least starting in parallel, we had given consideration to how it would assist around the management of electronic records as well. And again, to sort of maybe address Eamon's question before, the reason we split those two out was that we did acknowledge that electronic records, by their very nature, are so much more fragile and temperamental, I guess. And so we didn't really want to fold it into the 25-year thing simply because we didn't think they'd be around that long to manage. So hopefully, Eamon, that may address that question as well. But rest assured, we are actually doing stuff around the electronics stuff, and hope to have something around about the middle of next year, maybe earlier, depending on how we go. The other thing the survey revealed was that 73% of public officers have significant quantities of these records. They don't just have them, but you can see from the chart there's either 10 metres, which isn't that much, right up to 10 Ks worth of records out there amongst public officers. And that, if you're paying for that storage, that's costing a lot. And again, if you don't have to be paying for that, you're wasting money, essentially. So what do we do? I think reasonably uniquely for Archives New Zealand, we got the band back together. We brought everybody together from different sections and kind of sparked off each other. The project, as I mentioned, was initiated and I guess led by Appraisal with solid and fine support from our arrangement and description and repository management teams. Government record keeping as well. Access was involved, as well as representatives from our context control unit. And a lot of the work was actually done within a shared environment, and the reason I sort of bore you with this methodological stuff was I think it meant that we addressed, and hopefully managed to address, many of the issues that would otherwise have been maybe not seen or ignored if it had just been one section doing this. We worked on this for 6 months, and I do apologise if as I go through this I make assumptions that sort of, after having lived and breathed this for that long, to me are obvious, but to you guys aren't. So if I sort of gloss over something, please let me know and I'll try and address it. So ultimately over those 6 months, we developed the program that I'm launching today and a comms plan that we're sort of rolling out. This is part of that plan. So the program itself fits into our wider commitment to support efficient and high quality information management across government. And I guess what Mick is going to talk about later on is part of that broader package too. The program itself we are considering as a discrete unit, so we're looking at running this over 5 years. There's a bunch of products and tools that will plug into that and exist over that 5-year period. And one of the key things, and one of the things that we're really quite excited about, is that rather than being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff in many regards, waiting for public officers to come to us and say, look, we've got this shed we don't know what to do with, it's got a whole bunch of records in it, how do we do it? We're actually going to front foot and get out there and start talking to everybody. So we're looking to be a lot more proactive in how we address the issue. And at the risk of using another sports cliche, front foot it, if you like, so that we are getting out there over that 5-year period to talk to everybody. And just as an aside, when we first looked at this, we noted that there are 2,500 public officers out there, and my rough mathematics suggested that that would work out about 40 client visits a week for the team, which scared me just a little bit. And then we realised that most of those were schools and we could ignore them. So we've chunked it down to only about 210 public officers, and some of those indeed are outside of Wellington, where the regional offices of Archives New Zealand will take over. So it's a little bit more manageable than we initially thought. And the other thing I should point out as well is that the the methodology that we use to maybe particularly around the appraisal and transfer of records, hopefully should be scalable to how we just do business as a matter of course, if we can make this fly. So we developed a bunch of strategic aims, there are 15 in all, but really the key are the 3 distillations I've got there that will proactively provide support, helping public officers manage the legacy records that they hold, and thus enhance their information management. By 2013, we'll hopefully have disposal coverage in place for everyone. Now, I hasten to add that doesn't mean transfer at all, it's just simply disposal coverage. And thus to do that, we'll have developed a set of tools and other products to assist. So out of the thinking, we developed, I guess, 2.5, maybe 3 key products. The key one really, as far as you're concerned, is the roadmap, and the half a product, I guess, sitting under that is the transfer criteria, again, which may touch on some of Amon's questions from earlier. And the last product there is our own monitoring tool, and I'll touch on that a little bit as well, because again, sort of is the key measure that we'll use to do this front footing, the getting out there and assisting and being proactive. When we started first thinking about how we're going to do this, we sort of considered the whole process a bit of a journey, and so we're batting around the idea of, well, how do you successfully complete a journey, and my colleague Matt pointed out that a roadmap was pretty useful, so the term stuck. Essentially, it's an outline of the various steps that everybody has to go through to achieve full disposal coverage through essentially until transfer, and in some cases, depending on which side of the thing you're looking at, through until the actual archives provided in the reading room. We've taken a component-based approach, so that the roadmap itself is made up of a series of other instruments and products. And again, I think this addresses the other question from the floor. There are 2 key elements in a legal sense to the roadmap. The first is a blanket deferral of transfer agreement, essentially providing public officers with legal cover compliance for the period that the roadmap is intended to exist, essentially through until disposal authorisation is granted. And that's for all records that are covered by the legacy program. And it may be that when we first start out talking about this, that you don't actually know what you've got, other than a very brief, we've got a bunch of stuff. So even at that general level, we'll look to grant a deferral of transfer. And combined with that, of course, we need the Section 43 compliance issue, so that's the access agreement. And because in many cases we expect that material covered under that deferral will not be really well listed, that will be by default closed until the process is dealt with, just again to make it easier. And as John mentioned, those legal agreements will be registered through the public registers. The other key elements to the roadmap will be an agreement that sort of sets out the timeframes involved for each office and who's doing what. So there'll be the various, I guess, client managers, for want of a better term, at Archives New Zealand, so know who the individual is that you need to contact if you've got any questions. We'll discuss timeframes, what your business budget cycles might be, and various other things that will impact on the project for you guys as well. And keep those lines of communication open so everybody knows where everybody is at any particular point in the process. We've also developed an actual project plan, sort of an off-the-shelf that you can take and slot into your own workflows, which will set out the various requirements, the processes, links to the continuum products, who to talk to at Archives New Zealand as you're working your way through from appraisal to transfer and onwards. And to provide content for our monitoring tool, which I'll get onto in a minute, various elements in the map will we'll have you guys coming back to us saying, look, I've completed this stage, I'm moving on to the next, so we can have an idea as to how everybody's going, and thus have a pretty comprehensive view as to what the state of play is out there, and organise our resources accordingly. So just very briefly run through the various stages of the roadmap. And now the 11 stages are both external and internal, so when you sit down and talk with either myself or one of my colleagues in the initial stages, I think from memory there are only 6 for the public office side, and then there's another 5 for us. So, you know, first contact, good name for a movie, but also the sort of, oh my god, I've just discovered a shed full of stuff, or hi, I'm calling from Archives New Zealand, let's talk. John mentioned the utter crucialness of knowing what you've got. So we've developed, or are in the process of developing, a continuing publication that will help deal with, I've got stuff in my shed but I don't know what it is. So that's the record survey, just a broad brush overview. It's not a file-by-file examination at all. I've got some phone books, I've got some stationery, I've got some public records, that sort of level. The identification of the particular transfer category, and I'll get onto that in a minute, do you currently have disposal authority in place? There'll be a meeting to discuss things, how we're going, and to set out the deferral and the transfer, the deferral of transfer and the access agreements. And then the actual securing a disposal authority if you don't have one, or one can't be reactivated, and that may be a reasonably straightforward process if you've got a small bunch, or if you're a small public office, maybe a 3 or 4 year project if it's a massive public office covering various different regional sites and so on. We'll look to then lock down a transfer window. We'll sort of coordinate on that as we get close to the time, and then the various other obvious processes through to transfer and destruction. Now, the monitoring tool. Talking in general terms here, it's going to be a device that will give us, I've got the holistic, but a broad overview as to how everyone's going. Hopefully it will be providing us with up-to-date information, so at a glance we can see who's doing what and where, and juggle our resources accordingly. Particularly useful for the A&D transfer teams, who will be looking to slot people into the transfer windows as we get close to that. And ideally it should help us provide better customer service. We'll know where you are, so when you ring up we can actually say, yep, I know we've done this, this and this, and we're up to speed already. And excitingly, for the first time I can reveal the monitoring tool, which is Denise in front of the blackboard with a bunch of onions. Evidently onions can be used to absorb the smell of paint drying. Who knew? So again, this was a rather flippant remark at one of the meetings. We said, look, how are we going to do this? We don't have the electronic system in place, we don't have the budget to go out and buy a full function CRM. Why not just have a blackboard? And somebody took me seriously. So now we've got 16 metres worth of a blackboard down one of the hallways. But all facetiousness aside, the key thing with this, and if anybody's concerned that this might not actually be manageable under the Public Records Act, it's just a way of displaying information which will be otherwise captured in our records keeping system. But it's a way of allowing the entire business, all 120 staff in Wellington, to see who's doing what where. And again, as I said, to get that sort of in-your-face picture. One of the other things that we thought about was maybe having a bunch of webcams so that everybody could see. But that may just be a little bit too tricky. But again, I've learned not to be maybe as facetious as I am, because this might just happen. So anyway, the monitoring tool. Probably the most contentious issue at a guess. We're aware that in thinking about the 25-year-old records or the legacy records, that there were others as well which were just as important to transfer into archives custody as public archives. And again, possibly addressing Amon's issue. There are those that our readers particularly expect to show up on a regular basis, and I've got probates as a clear example of that. There'll be others, particularly around the Treaty of Waitangi process. There are also records that are clearly archives and clearly at risk or significant. Again, if somebody showed up with a copy of the treaty, we wouldn't say, well, hop on the legacy program, we'll deal with that in a minute. So that the program itself is hopefully flexible enough to deal with contingencies as they arise. So the third category of transfer is the legacy record bucket, if you like. And within that, there's a series of considerations that we'll go through that look at things like the perceived value of the records. Now, again, this is reasonably subjective, and I've mentioned there that it's different from appraisal. This is sort of that, well, are they operational records that have been sentenced to be archives, or are they of genealogical value, or do they have any other special characteristics? So, again, a weighting given to those. How ready is a public office to actually transfer, dispose of them? What is their age? If there's a bunch of records out there that's dating from the 1860s, then we'd probably want to get those into our care more promptly than records that are from the 1970s or early 80s. What are the conditions that the records are currently stored in? What resources are available to the public office looking to transfer to get them ready? And what are the benefits that the public office itself can derive from getting rid of them? Will it save them money and so on? So a whole bunch of criteria. There's top level, there's a whole bunch of sort of formulae behind that, but essentially these are the sorts of things that we'll be looking at as part of the actual negotiation and agreement process. Along with the roadmap, the monitoring tool, and that sort of subsection of the transfer criteria, a bunch of supporting tools and products that we're developing. We've got, as I mentioned, how to figure out what records you've got in a shed type product coming on. We've got a bunch of internal workflow changes that we're making as well. John talked a lot about deferral of transfer. At the moment, that process sits with our arrangement and description team, and that's going to move to my section in appraisal. And it will also be we'll expect it to be flagged in appraisal reports as well. And some of the sort of functionality within Archway, our finding aid system will be changed as well to accommodate the program. And of course, those of you who've been on our record keeping courses can, if you happen to come back for whatever reason, if they weren't successful enough in the first place, the elements of the program will be incorporated into those as well where appropriate. So the nuts and bolts really are, as I said, there's lots of public officers taught, not as many as I first thought, thankfully, but around 210. Not everybody holds legacy records, but we'll nevertheless try and get out and talk to everybody regardless. So from September, the four of us in appraisal will look to get out and start talking to everybody. We've chunked public officers up into sort of client portfolios of around 40 each, which we'll use to, again, create that sense of consistency. You'll know who your account manager is, for want of a better term, and hopefully that will ensure that there's clear lines of communication running all the way through the program. I mentioned as well that the public officers whose head office isn't in Wellington will be managed by our regional archivists. And the aim is at least that over the next 12 months, through until the end of the financial year next year, our team at least will have got out and started talking. That's not to say that any necessarily formal agreements will have been come to, but we'll at least have got out there, made contact and started the process. And just before questions, I had looked, there must be some massive party going on in Wellington, because I went out and tried to buy a party popper just to sort of formally launch this thing, but unfortunately couldn't find anything, so the program is launched. Liz. Any questions? Lots.
Deirdre Wogan. It's quite interesting to hear the turnaround in your thinking from this year, from last year, particularly about deferral of records. So I'd like to claim a tiny bit of credit for driving you all mad about them. Have you got any figures on which organisations hold the most really old records? Because I am concerned right now with 19th century records that need conservation, can't be managed. You know, you can't really expect organisations that are working in the here and now to put a lot of budget into these. What sort of help have you got planned for that kind of, you know, we're talking really, really old records here. We're not talking the 70s, which to me is not very long ago, I have to say. We're talking about last century, or the century before last, in fact.
There are, I guess, a couple of aspects to that. One is that I think half the time, it's maybe a bit unfair, but there'll be quite a lot of cases where I think when we start talking, people don't actually know what they've got initially. So hopefully just having a program like this will start to make some of those older records more visible, and then we can start to deal with them. From a practical point of view, I think I mentioned it's a 5-year program. The key thing with that is that the program itself is, I think, flexible enough to identify where some of those agencies, particularly those large and diverse ones, with heaps of different regional offices. The roadmap is designed so that we can actually build in, I guess, time for budget bids and various other sort of let's get this sorted out built into it, so that as we go through it, it'll become more and more, I guess, that they'll be all captured up into that program. As far as resources from Archives New Zealand go, that's a little bit above my head, and I would be very surprised if we were to sort of start throwing our own cash around. This is something that we're doing to support the sentencing of records, essentially, if that makes sense. Helen.
Don't worry. I've just got 3 questions really around, and I'm really pleased that you've included this, the reactivation of old disposal authorities. My questions are in relation to, presumably you're going to have some criteria around the reuse of them. If so, when is that coming out? And
Looking around for Mark.
This may also, you mentioned before about this being used potentially for the transfer of other types of records, I mean, records that are not 25 years old. Would that still include the reuse of disposal authorities, of existing disposal authorities?
To answer the first part, the reactivation, we're thinking clearly ad hoc disposals, one-off disposal authorities, just makes sense. I mean, the fact that they actually have a time limit on them at the moment is kind of anomalous, I'd say. For schedules, that is a bit more problematic, and I think I'd be reluctant to just do it without, I guess, reasonable assurance that there hadn't been any change. Quite the level of that assurance and what change would be acceptable, we haven't really thought of yet. But certainly from those ad hoc ones, there doesn't seem to be any reason to my mind that we wouldn't just say, look, if you can assure us that you've not been going in there and either adding stuff to the boxes outside of the list or taking stuff out of the boxes, then that'll be cool. As far as the using it as a basis for everything, we haven't really thought that far down that track. It was sort of, whatever we do, why don't we do it in such a way that if we want to, we can move it forward. But again, that's sort of, to be fair, that hasn't really, we've only just got above the parapet at the moment. But I don't see, theoretically, why not. Again, we'll just have to do a bit more thinking around it, I guess.
Would it be on a case-by-case
Yeah.
basis kind of thing?
Yeah.
Interesting you mentioned about schedules, because in my experience, I would have thought schedules would have been actually easier, because a lot of disposal actions and schedules are time, like, destroy in 10 years or 25 years anyway. So to make those authorities still valid at that time would kind of make sense.
Yeah, this is the sort of thing that kind of makes my brain hurt, because what point do you apply the sentencing, and at what point do you go back and say, well, my thinking at this stage was this, this and this? And you're almost trying to capture two different discrete points in time in the one document. So yeah, again, I think the ad hocs make, to my mind, better sense, because they're at least locked down, and the records, to use non-continuum speak, are at least dead. They've been sort of banished off into the box, and whereas the schedules are a bit more living, breathing document, and potentially, as organisations mature, develop, change, whatever, their functions, their roles, activities change, and sentencing, people doing the sentencing change, move on, or what have you as well. So it's not quite as, I don't think, clear-cut, maybe, as you'd hope.
Graham Thompson from Parliamentary Council Office. I've got a question because, again related to schedules, twice during your presentation and once during John Roberts, there was mention of the application of an agency's disposal schedules and the need for ensuring that they have a schedule. But isn't that what the GDAs were developed for? Because I know that it is possible to apply GDAs to records which are not covered in my current schedule.
Absolutely. There's sorry, and again, this is probably one of those things where my thinking got ahead of me, really. Our assumption is that a lot of this stuff will be dealt with simply as a sentencing exercise under the GDAs themselves anyway. I don't know quite what the percentages would be, but they're designed essentially for this issue. To be fair, there is that grandfather date, so they'll only go back and cover records through to 46, and records prior to that will have to be sentenced or disposed of under a specific authority. But absolutely, the GDAs are designed for this very issue, amongst other various issues, specific issues. Susan.
I've got the microphone, so I'm going to ask the question. Susan Scudder. I just want to carry on with Helen's discussion about schedules or one-off authorities. What about the case of an agency that had a schedule written and that then never implemented it, and now it's expired? I mean, isn't there then a case to reactivate for at least the records that were created prior to the sign-off of the schedule?
Yes, he says hesitantly.
Tom, I just,
Yeah, I think that'd be fair if, again, the records had been sentenced rather than simply created. Does that make sense? So I think there'd have had to have been stuff done under that instrument rather than just have it exist and then go back to it. The other thing as well is we'd look at dates, because if the schedule itself was authorised prior to 98, which was predated the appraisal standard, then I think we'd be probably a little bit more reluctant to look at reactivating it, simply because the thinking had changed so much.
Okay, I do want to make the point though that there are a lot of schedules out there that have been signed off by the Chief Archivist, and then the agencies, for one reason or another, have not been able to actually implement them. So it seems like a bit of a waste.
Yeah, true. I think there's one down here, Mark.
Hi, Tom. It's Jeff Bethel from Industrial Research Limited. I know you and I have discussed this between ourselves at times, but in the unique situation of the Crown Research Institute, who have DSIR records stemming from 1992 backwards, we're not quite in the 25-year plus legacy category, but we're only 16. But for us, would you be able to include all former DSIR records in your legacy program?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you guys would be alone by any stretch in terms of having inherited records from predecessor agencies. And again, this is sort of probably me being sloppy in how I explain things. My assumption would be that in many cases, one-off appraisals would be, outside of the GDA process particularly, would be appropriate for some of these legacy records. In other cases, a full schedule covering everybody, the whole gamut would be appropriate. So that's something that we'd talk about when we sort of sit down with your account manager, for want of a better term. I'm aware that we're sort of whipping over time, so one more question, and I'm going to be lurking, so if anybody wants to bail me up offline, I'll be more than happy to take questions. So, was there? No? Oh, sorry. Di.
Hi, Di Dixon. I'm just wondering how Archives New Zealand is going to be helping agencies who are dealing with their legacy records. They are doing a business plan to get implementers and sentences in and to get it listed and boxed. And then they come across a long waiting list that they then have to go back to their bosses and say, well, the records aren't going to actually be taken for 5 years. And the bosses say, well, let's not do the project for 4 years then.
Sure, that's a good question. And I think one of the aims of the project is actually to, talking about front-footing it, is that we'd actually get out there and have these conversations before you get to that stage, so that at least that roadmap, if you like, will cover everything. Now, some of those dates will be pretty nebulous to start with, but as we work through the process, we should actually be able to get a better handle on who else out there is doing stuff, so that we can have better, I guess, more knowledgeable decision making based on capacity, both outside where agencies are in the process and what we have coming in at any one time. So I know that will take a while to flow through as we get going, but hopefully it should make that management a lot more effective than it has been maybe in the past.
Also, it should be a lot cheaper now than it was in 4 years' time.
Yeah, true. I'll close it there, but as I said, if anybody's got further questions, please come and see me after.
Thanks for that, Tom. I think the Legacy Records program, we've got opportunity for archives to be more proactive in our support of organisations who are dealing with legacy records in the organisation.